The rain, that afternoon, had a certain stubbornness about it, the kind that refused to turn to drizzle or storm, content instead to linger in its own quiet melancholy. I remember sitting by the window of the Jericho Tavern, my fingers tracing the damp ring of my glass, watching water slide down the pane in thin, uncertain paths. The place smelled faintly of wet coats and cheap cigars, though someone, somewhere near the bar, had ordered roast lamb. The scent rose and fell like a forgotten promise. My crossword was nearly done, but not quite. There is something faintly tragic about a puzzle with one word missing, especially when the clue stares back at you with a kind of insolent simplicity. Lock without a key. 6 letters. I had penciled in secret, then rubbed it out again. It felt right and wrong in equal measure, as most things in life do. I stared at it a long while, thinking not of locks but of people, of how rarely we are truly opened, and how much of our lives we spend guarding rooms we've already left. The rain deepened. A bus passed outside, sending a sheet of muddy water against the curb. In the corner, a man with a newspaper turned a page too heavily and muttered an apology to no one in particular. The radio, mounted above the bar, hummed with the strained politeness of a BBC announcer reading the news. I wasn't listening. Not really. My attention was on the crossword again, or perhaps on the condensation slowly gathering on my glass. It was only when I caught the words, "found dead in his rooms at St. Oswald's College," that I looked up. Something about the phrase, the gentle finality of "found dead," never fails to still me. The announcer continued, voice steady as a metronome. Authorities report that Dr. Simon Fenwick, lecturer in English literature, was discovered earlier this morning in his study. The door was locked from the inside. Police suspect no foul play. I think it was the last sentence that irritated me, no foul play. Such phrases are always too easy, like a closing remark in a bad novel. I turned back to my crossword, but the clue had changed. Not literally, of course, but in meaning. Lock without a key. I wrote it again, slower this time, the pencil hovering as if the answer might emerge from the air itself. A young barmaid passed by, wiping a table already clean. She said something about the weather, the sort of remark people make to avoid silence. I nodded, perhaps smiled, though the gesture never reached my eyes. She left me alone, which was all I wanted. The rain was thick enough now to blur the shapes of bicycles chained along the wall outside. Oxford looked, as it often does, like a city half drowned in memory. I thought briefly of Fenwick, the name faintly familiar, perhaps from a seminar or a poetry reading I'd once attended out of misplaced curiosity. English literature. They so often are. I imagined a man surrounded by books, the smell of dust and stale wine in the air, a window left slightly open despite the cold. A locked door, a key on the inside. There are only so many ways to die in Oxford, but each manages to find a different sadness. Lewis would later tell me I'd looked troubled that afternoon. Perhaps I was, but it wasn't the death itself. Death in Oxford is almost a local custom. It was the manner of it. A locked room speaks to a certain arrogance or desperation, either a man trying to keep the world out or the world ensuring he never leaves. I couldn't decide which unsettled me more. The crossword lay half-finished on the table when I left. I folded it into my coat pocket with the care one gives to something that might later become important. The rain met me like an old friend as I stepped outside, the pavement glistening, lamplight bending in every puddle. A taxi crawled past, its headlights soft as candle flames. I remember hesitating, considering going home. But then the word returned, locked. It held a certain rhythm, a finality. I turned instead toward St. Oswald's. Habit, perhaps, or fate, if one believes in such things. As I crossed the bridge, the bells of Magdalen tolled the hour, slow, patient, indifferent. I thought of the clue again, of the 6 empty boxes waiting for their answer. Lock without a key. I still hadn't solved it, but something in me knew that, Before the rain ended, I would. There is a silence peculiar to Oxford colleges, the kind that feels deliberate, as if centuries of whispered Latin prayers had been absorbed by the very stones. Street Oswald's was no different. Its quadrangle seemed to breathe under the weight of drizzle, its flagstones dark and slick as old ink. Lewis walked a few paces behind me, his boots leaving obedient echoes. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled 9:30, though it might have been any century at all. We were met by the porter, a man built entirely of starch and suspicion. He led us wordlessly through a corridor lined with portraits whose painted eyes regarded us with the disdain reserved for visitors. The air smelled of chalk, wet wool, and something faintly floral, lilies perhaps, though out of place in February. I noticed a scrap of paper wedged beneath a doorframe as we passed, half-soaked, bearing the faded words Gaudeamus igitur. I left it untouched. The living rarely like reminders of mortality. Fenwick's rooms were in staircase D, at the far corner of the quad, a corner so narrow that even the rain seemed reluctant to enter. The door had been forced earlier that morning, its lock now hanging like a question unanswered. Inside, the room was both orderly and exhausted, books everywhere, yet none out of place, their spines forming a kind of brittle geometry along the walls. The curtains were half drawn, the air dense with the mingled scents of tobacco and cork. Fenwick himself sat, or rather slumped, beside his desk, head bowed as though mid-thought. The chair beneath him looked too slight for such stillness. His hand rested on a notebook, a fountain pen fallen just out of reach. Death, when it comes in silence, often leaves behind an impression of waiting, as if the body has merely paused in conversation. I've seen enough of them to know the difference between despair and interruption, though at that moment I wasn't certain which this was. The coroner had already been, a sensible man, all conclusions and no curiosity. He gestured toward the bottle of claret half empty, 2 glasses nearby, one faintly smudged. "Suicide," he said, with the patience of a man late for lunch. The door was locked from within, key still in place. No sign of struggle, no note, no witness, a neat narrative, wrapped and tied. Lewis asked about the key, examining it as though it might confess under pressure. A simple Yale, unremarkable, save for the faint film of wax near its teeth. He mentioned it offhandedly, unaware that I'd already seen it. I kept the detail to myself. Wax belonged to sealing, not to keys. On the desk lay Fenwick's last work, a translation of Catullus. The page was open at poem 85, Odi et Amo, I hate and I love. I told Lewis that perhaps the good doctor had been rehearsing his own epitaph. He didn't laugh. He rarely does when I attempt humor in Latin. I walked once around the room. On the mantel stood an unlit candle, its wick freshly trimmed. A framed photograph beside it, a woman, pale, unsmiling, caught in the delicate cruelty of formal portraiture. Julia Fenwick, I would later learn. There was dust on the glass except where a thumb had recently wiped it clean. That small act, a human trace among academic order, seemed more intimate than the dead man's face. Lewis was asking about the windows. They were latched. The porter confirmed no other keys existed. The set had been issued solely to Dr. Fenwick. I could almost hear the tidy conclusion forming in the coroner's mind again, locked from the inside, therefore self-inflicted. The simplest path is always the most misleading. Oxford has taught me that often enough. Before leaving, I noticed the rug beneath the desk, its edge slightly curled, a damp mark near one corner, as though something cold had been set there briefly and removed. A decanter, perhaps, or another glass. I didn't point it out. Some things are better left to settle in the mind until they choose their moment. Outside, the rain had turned from drizzle to mist. The porter locked the stairway behind us, an unnecessary gesture, given how little remained to guard. Lewis said he'd wager on suicide, the bottle and the Latin making convenient accomplices. I said nothing. My eyes were on the college windows, each one dark except a single lamp burning faintly above the library arch. It flickered once, then steadied. As we crossed the quad, the echo of our steps folded into the stone. I thought again of the open page, Odi et amo, hate and love, bound in the same breath, a paradox that suited both poets and murderers. And as the rain began again, thin and persistent, I found myself thinking less of Fenwick's death than of the untouched second glass, and the faint trace of wax that should never have been there at all. The library of Street Oswald's had that particular chill which no fire could quite dispel, the kind that seeps from stone and memory alike. It was late afternoon when I met her there. Light slanted through the high windows, catching the suspended dust as though each particle carried its own confession. Julia Fenwick sat at one of the long oak tables, a book closed before her, fingers resting lightly on the cover as if unsure whether to hold or release it. She greeted me with the composure of someone accustomed to polite observation. Her voice was soft, level, untouched by the hysteria one might expect of a widow. There is a kind of grace in control, but it always hides something, grief perhaps, or guilt. She said she preferred to remain in the college until the funeral. Her husband had loved these rooms, she explained. He found comfort among things that never answered back. I remember thinking that loneliness has a way of disguising itself as scholarship. We walked between the shelves together. The air smelled of vellum, dust, and something faintly medicinal polish, perhaps. She spoke of Simon's habits, his long evenings translating Latin verse, his fascination with puzzles, his irritation with people who solved them too quickly. I listened. The words were affectionate enough, yet there was a peculiar detachment in her tone, as if she were reciting from a well-practiced script. He had, she said, grown distant these last weeks, locked away in his rooms, speaking little, drinking more. He'd become obsessed with a poem, one that had arrived anonymously, a few lines left beneath his door one morning, unsigned. She believed he thought it was written for him. Perhaps to him. Then she added, after a hesitation too slight for anyone but me to notice, that it was written in his own hand. The pause between the words carried more truth than the sentence itself. Lewis would have asked the obvious question how one could mistake another's hand for one's own, but I preferred silence. People reveal far more to a quiet listener than to an inquisitor. She turned toward the window, where students were crossing the quad, their umbrellas bright against the gloom. They laughed, the sound sharp and unfeeling against the damp stones. Life continuing, indifferent. I asked whether she had seen the poem. Only once, she said. Her husband had burned it the same evening. Yet she remembered a phrase, something about doors and silence. It had unsettled him, though she couldn't say why. He'd been working on a translation of Catullus at the time, and sometimes he blurred his own words with those of the dead. I told her poets often do. There was a framed photograph on the desk, the two of them at some garden party, her smile slight and professional, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses, a woman and a man sharing proximity but not presence. I wondered whether the distance in that photograph had preceded the poem, or followed it. She poured tea without asking whether I wanted any, which I took as a sign of good breeding or fatigue, perhaps both. Her hands were steady. A thin gold band glinted as she adjusted the teapot lid. I noticed the faint indentation on her ring finger, not from wear, but from absence. She had removed the ring recently, then put it back on for my benefit. People underestimate how much a detective learns from the vanity of the bereaved. We spoke for a while about trivialities, college gossip, the weather, the expense of replacing old windows. Each remark landed carefully, like a chess piece moved with studied caution. When she finally asked whether I thought Simon had taken his own life, I heard, beneath the calm inquiry, a tremor not of fear, but of anticipation. I told her it was too soon to say. She smiled then, the faintest movement, as though my uncertainty pleased her. When I left, the porter was locking the outer gate. Rain had begun again. The kind that falls in thin needles, half sound, half memory. I paused beneath the archway and looked back toward the library windows. One was still lit, her silhouette motionless behind the glass. I thought of that hesitation, the pause before she said own, and it returned to me like the echo of a note struck in an empty hall. Later, over a drink, I tried to recall the words she'd used to describe the poem. Doors and silence. I scribbled them in the margin of my notebook beside the crossword clue I still hadn't solved. For a moment, the two seemed connected, as if somewhere between them lay the outline of a truth not yet ready to be spoken. Outside, laughter drifted faintly from the streets beyond the college, and the rain erased the rest. The dean received me with the sort of politeness reserved for men who arrive uninvited but cannot be dismissed. His office smelled faintly of incense and old sermons. A single lamp burned on the desk, throwing a circle of pale gold over the papers he hadn't been reading. The rest of the room lingered in half-light books in high cases, hymnals bound in cracked leather, a clock that ticked too loudly, as if protesting my presence. Reverend Markham was the kind of man Oxford produces when it's trying to appear humble. Handsome once, smooth still, with the look of someone accustomed to having his voice carry authority. He greeted me with a nod, his lips curving toward civility but never reaching it. He said the college hoped the police might keep this dreadful matter as quiet as possible. Street. Oswald's, after all, had endured enough in the press. I told him I'd do my best, though my best, in such matters, seldom aligned with discretion. He spoke of Fenwick with what he must have thought compassion. A tragic figure, he said. Debts, perhaps a mistress, a nervous temperament. He'd grown erratic, forgetful, unwell. These things happen in academia, he added, as though vice were a byproduct of scholarship. His voice was calm, too calm, the language of a man constructing distance, plank by plank, from the dead. While he talked, my eyes wandered. There was a photograph on the far wall, a garden party, all white tablecloths and champagne smiles. Fenwick stood at the center, one hand in his pocket, the other around a glass. Beside him, Julia Fenwick, elegant, distracted, her gaze caught by something outside the frame, and between them, the dean, his hand resting lightly, far too lightly on her shoulder. It was a small gesture, the kind that could pass unnoticed by everyone but the photographer, yet it lingered like a shadow across the picture. Markham must have followed my gaze. He said it was taken last summer, the college fete. Julia had organized the music. He had admired her efficiency, a fine woman and a great comfort to Simon. I asked whether comfort had been mutual. His smile faltered. I liked him better for that. He went on about pastoral duties, academic pressures, the loneliness of scholarly life. I lit a cigarette, ignoring the faint tightening around his eyes, the moral distaste for habits less respectable than hypocrisy. Smoke drifted upward, mixing with the scent of furniture polish. I asked, gently, whether he had visited Fenwick recently. He looked at me for a long moment, the clock marking each second like a reminder. Only once, he said, the evening before the man died. Simon was anxious, troubled about his finances. I advised him to rest. His voice was perfectly even, but his hands betrayed him, fingers clasped too tightly around a paper knife, as if the object itself required restraint. I nodded, thanked him, and left before he could ask me to. Outside, the chapel bell struck 10. The sound folded through the courtyard, low and deliberate, the way time moves in places where nothing ever truly changes. Lewis was waiting near the gate, stamping his feet against the cold. He asked what I made of the holy man. I told him I hadn't yet decided whether the dean was lying or merely rehearsed. He grinned, the way younger men do when they think they've solved something simple. Then he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that one of the porters had seen the dean's car parked near Fenwick's staircase on the night of the death. Visiting the poor soul, he said. The words hung between us, half jest, half accusation. I didn't answer. Instead, I lit another cigarette, the match flaring briefly in the wind before surrendering. The smoke caught in my throat. A confession, or a habit, I've never been sure which. As we crossed the quad, the rain began again, fine as breath. From somewhere behind the chapel glass came the faint sound of a choir rehearsal, a hymn about mercy, sung without conviction. I thought of the photograph in the dean's office, of his hand resting lightly on Julia Fenwick's shoulder, and of how easily one could confuse comfort with possession. Lewis said something about getting supper. I nodded, but my thoughts were elsewhere on the parked car, the borrowed sympathy, and the peculiar serenity of a man who insists that sin, like scandal, is best kept behind closed doors. The door to the dean's office, I remembered, had been locked when I arrived. Locked, and yet the key had been waiting inside. I spent the morning alone in Fenwick's rooms, the curtains drawn against a drizzle that refused to become proper rain. The place was less an office than a confession left mid-sentence, lecture notes scattered in disciplined disorder, receipts folded neatly beside unpaid bills, an open tin of pipe tobacco, releasing its stubborn perfume into the cold air. Death had not disturbed the room's symmetry. It had merely silenced it. His desk was the sort of thing a man chooses to outlive him oak, uncompromising, with a single drawer that stuck as if reluctant to share its contents. Inside, I found nothing remarkable. Overdue notices, a theatre program, a torn letter addressed to J. But beneath a stack of Catullus translations lay a photograph that made me pause. Julia again, younger by a decade perhaps, standing in a garden, her hair unbound, the light of summer pressed against her like a promise. On the back, in elegant handwriting, the words, "To S. from M." I sat a while, turning it over in my hand, studying the ink, the intimacy implied by its restraint, the initial M, that old adversary, ambiguity. Markham, perhaps, the dean, or someone else entirely, but the inscription carried a tone I recognized, the language of affection disguised as formality. Love, like poetry, often pretends at brevity to conceal indulgence. Lewis had left earlier to check Fenwick's accounts. The man's debts were substantial, but nothing that suggested desperation. Scholars in Oxford owed money as naturally as they breathed. It was, in its own way, an intellectual tradition. What interested me was not what Fenwick owed, but to whom, and whether that debt had ever been repaid in kind. I pocketed the photograph, a minor sin in service of a greater curiosity, and made my way to the typing room in the administrative wing. Miss Halliwell was there, small and neat as a comma, her hands moving over the keys of a battered Remington with the rhythm of long habit. She looked up when I entered, the faintest flush of self-consciousness crossing her face. She had known Fenwick well, she said. Kind man, brilliant in his own quiet way, not the sort one expected to end badly. Her eyes flickered toward the window as she spoke, a subtle avoidance, the kind that accompanies partial truth. I asked whether she'd noticed anything unusual in his recent work. She hesitated. There had been, she admitted at last, a change. He'd been agitated, distracted, obsessed even, with something he'd found among the college archives. An old document, perhaps, or a letter. She didn't know exactly, only that he had called it a buried indiscretion. The phrase lingered in her mouth as though it had belonged to someone else. I asked if he had confided in her further. She shook her head, a gesture too quick, too rehearsed. But she mentioned that the dean had come to see him not long after. I said nothing. The rain at the window offered its own punctuation. Before leaving, I glanced at the typewriter. The ribbon was fresh, the paper crisp. A half-finished letter waited in the carriage, unsent. I read the first line silently. To the editor, regarding the matter of Street Oswald's archives, the rest was incomplete, the keys frozen mid-thought. Back in my rooms that evening, I poured myself a measure of whiskey and put on Wagner Tannhäuser, the overture. It filled the air with its heavy redemption, the kind of music that makes one believe in tragedy even when one ought to resist it. I sat in my chair, the photograph beside me, the crossword on my lap. The clue that had troubled me for days stared up once more, lock without a key. I thought of Fenwick's door, of the wax trace on the key, of Julia's pause before she said own, of the dean's hand resting a fraction too long on her shoulder. And then, as the violins lifted, the answer came quietly, inevitable as rain, secret. I wrote it in slowly, the pencil scratching like thought itself. A secret, the simplest and most complex of locks, and the only one that never truly stays closed. Somewhere in the city, a bell struck 11. The sound echoed through the music, half in time, half out. I poured another drink, stared at the photograph again, and wondered not for the first time whether the most dangerous secrets were those people shared, or those they merely left lying in books, waiting for someone foolish enough to read between the lines. Lewis had a way of leaning against doorframes as though every case required physical support. He did it that afternoon in Fenwick's rooms, his hands sunk deep into his pockets, his gaze steady but untroubled. Suicide, he said. Trick lock, or maybe a spare key. It was a tone he used when he hoped I might agree, if only to save time. I told him no. The word came out softer than intended, like the beginning of a sigh. No man who quotes Catullus in his final hour intends to die quietly. I saw his brow crease, the faint impatience of a man who never trusted poets. But death leaves traces that reason can't quite smooth away, and reason, I've learned, is never as reliable as instinct. The lock itself was an old brass cylinder, tarnished, innocent to the casual eye. The coroner's report had described it as untampered but tampering. In Oxford, rarely takes the form of violence. I knelt, examining the key that had been found on the inside of the door. A faint glimmer caught the light, a residue of wax near the grooves. Someone had pressed it once carefully, patiently into a mold. Lewis watched, frowning. A copy, I murmured. Not a spare, but an imitation. He asked why anyone would bother. Because, I said, sometimes the simplest way to open a door is to make it believe you belong inside. He said nothing after that. We left the room as we had found it, unremarkable, undecided, faintly sad. The corridor outside smelled of varnish and rain. Somewhere a clock struck 5, its chime dull and half-hearted. We walked together as far as the quad, and then I told him to go on without me. I needed air, though what I meant was silence. The evening had already begun to fold itself around the college. The grass shone with the dampness of recent drizzle, and the gargoyles along the parapets watched in their usual mockery of patience. I traced the familiar paths with no destination in mind. There's a rhythm to thought that can only be found in walking each step, unsettling what the mind pretends to know. A false key, a secret meeting, a second glass of wine. I repeated the words under my breath, as though they might align themselves into coherence. A student hurried past, head bent beneath an umbrella, the scent of wet wool trailing after him. From an open window somewhere came the brittle sound of laughter. A college party, perhaps. I wondered, not for the first time, how easily joy persists in proximity to the dead. The living are skilled at forgetting on schedule. I found myself drawn, almost involuntarily, toward the chapel. The door stood ajar, and the light within was dim, half filtered through the stained glass that still carried the last embers of day. The organist, a thin figure I did not recognize, was playing something low and deliberate, the sort of music that seems to hesitate between beauty and resignation. It took me a moment to place the melody, a few bars from Tannhäuser, the same passage Fenwick had quoted in his final letter. He who returns from the mountain of Venus finds no peace in prayer. I stood, listening, the sound filling the hollow spaces of the chapel like a slow tide. Coincidence, perhaps, but I've never had much faith in those. I walked down the aisle, the stone cold beneath my shoes. The light from the candles trembled against the polished brass of the organ pipes, reflections bending and reforming with every note. I thought again of Fenwick, of his empty glass, his borrowed despair. A man reaching toward poetry not for solace but for witness. When the music stopped, the silence felt almost insolent. I stayed a moment longer, staring at the altar, an unconvincing arrangement of lilies and dying roses. I thought of Julia, of the dean, of Miss Halliwell's anxious fingers on the typewriter keys. Everyone hiding something behind the polite drapery of Oxford civility. Secrets never needed locked doors. They needed only the illusion of one. Outside, the bell tower began to toll the hour. I stood beneath it until the sound faded into the dark. The rain had begun again. Light and deliberate, each drop dissolving the day a little more. I lit a cigarette and watched the smoke rise through the damp air, curling upward, aimless. Somewhere behind me, the organ resumed the same refrain, quiet this time, almost human in its exhaustion. A false key. A secret meeting. A second glass of wine. The notes carried through the rain like a confession whispered to no one at all. The Bodleian has a smell I've never been able to forget, dust and discipline, parchment and patience. It's a scent that suggests time isn't passing but circling quietly above you, waiting for permission to descend. I'd been there often enough, usually for reasons that had little to do with police work. But that morning the place felt colder, as if the walls themselves were withholding something. Archivist, a spare man in a cardigan, the color of weak tea, spoke with the caution of one who has handled too many lives reduced to paper. He had found the letter while cataloguing correspondence from a minor Oxford press, a thin envelope, no more than a page and a half within, written by Simon Fenwick roughly 3 weeks before his death. The archivist placed it on the table between us, as if afraid it might bruise. The letter began politely, as such things always do. "Dear Mr. Ashcroft," it read, "I have stumbled upon a document that will, I suspect, unsettle certain reputations, long considered unblemished." He spoke of a discovery in the college archives, a private exchange between 2 fellows of Street Oswalds, dating from the early 50s, and implied that one of them had gone on to attain a post of moral authority. The letter ended with a cryptic assurance that he would write again once he had confirmed its authenticity. Attached, the archivist said, was a poem. He handed it to me delicately, as if passing on an infection. The title, typed neatly in black ribbon, read, "The Locked Room." Beneath it, the verses unfurled with an unnerving symmetry. A door that closes from within. A key that hides in plain disguise. A breath, a prayer, a soundless hymn, and nothing left but borrowed lies. It was the kind of amateur verse one might dismiss too literal, too arranged, and yet the imagery was disturbingly precise. Door closed. Key turned. Silence. It was Fenwick's death in miniature. But it was the final line that halted me. I am not the author. The archivist, watching my face, asked whether I thought it meant anything. I said it meant everything, though I wasn't yet sure how. I examined the paper. The typing was recent, the ribbon still sharp, but the envelope was addressed, not in Fenwick's looping, uncertain script, but in a hand I recognized at once. Small, deliberate, ecclesiastical. The dean's. I carried the letter to the window, where the light fell coldly across the page. The ink of Fenwick's signature bled faintly into the fibers, the mark of cheap fountain pen ink. His tone was measured, even confident. But beneath it, I heard something else. The quiet thrill of a man who believes he's found power at last, though not the kind he can keep. Lewis arrived halfway through the morning, his coat damp, his expression bright with that unfailing optimism of men who think mysteries are made to be solved. I handed him the letter without explanation. He read it once, frowned, then again, slower. He asked what I made of the phrase, "I am not the author." "Perhaps," I said, "it means what it says, or perhaps it's a warning." He shrugged, muttered something about poets and riddles, and wandered off to talk to the archivist. I remained by the window, staring down into the quad below, where students crossed like silent notes on a sheet of pale stone. When Lewis returned, he mentioned that Fenwick had visited the Bodleian 3 times in his final week, requesting files from the college archives. The last of these had never been returned. Missing, the archivist had said, with an almost professional sorrow. We left soon after. Outside, Oxford was half buried in drizzle, the kind that erases edges but not outlines. I carried the poem in my pocket, folded twice. On the walk back, the words looped themselves through my thoughts until they no longer felt like verse but accusation. A door that closes from within. At the lodge gate, Lewis asked whether I thought the dean could have written the poem. His tone was casual, but the question lingered between us like smoke. I didn't answer. There are moments in investigation, as in life, when silence is the only form of honesty. That evening, at home, I laid the letter on my desk. The handwriting stared back at me, neat, clerical, self-assured. I poured a whiskey and stared at it until the words blurred. Then I read the last line aloud, softly. As if to no one, I am not the author. For the first time in days, I believed it. I confronted the dean in his study once more. The afternoon sun slanting across the desk, slicing the room into rectangles of light and shadow. He was perfectly composed, as always, the smoothness of his manner both comforting and unsettling. He admitted, with careful pacing, that he had visited Simon Fenwick that night. Yes, he had been distressed, agitated, muttering about some forgotten expense, some minor disgrace. I listened while he spoke, noting the absence of hesitation, the absence of anything untoward in the cadences of his voice. He claimed he had left him alive. Julia Fenwick was present too, seated in the corner, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles whitened beneath the soft silk of her gloves. She had been silent until I pressed her, gently, on what she feared her husband had discovered. Then the tears came slow, deliberate, precise. She admitted that she had worried he might have learned of her affair with Markham years ago, a thing she had managed to keep buried beneath smiles and appearances. Her voice shook, but only at the edges, never in the center. I noticed it immediately. There was too much calculation in the timing, too little warmth in the pitch. Lewis, ever eager for clarity, pronounced his judgment before I could form mine. The story was simple, he said. Jealousy, despair, perhaps suicide. The elements aligned neatly. A disgraced husband, a hidden lover, a bottle of claret, a locked room. It was comfortable, tidy, like the last piece of a jigsaw clicked into place on a table. I did not speak. I watched the shadows in the corners of the room, the way the light fell on Julia's cheekbones, the almost imperceptible twitch of her left eyelid. Small gestures, tiny admissions that escaped the careless eye. My unease grew like a slow tide, creeping around the edges of the obvious. Life, I thought, seldom arranges itself so cleanly. The dean continued, outlining his evening with meticulous calm. He had spoken gently, tried to soothe Simon's agitation, reminded him that the archives were nothing to worry about, that Simon had promised to review the documents in the morning. He had left the room in order, in peace. There were no abrupt gestures, no violent outbursts, only the careful choreography of a man aware of appearances. Julia's tears were more revealing than the dean's words. She dabbed at them with the edge of a handkerchief, then folded her hands neatly again. "A lady," she said, "must always be prepared for observation, even in sorrow." Her fear had been sincere, yes, but the way she allowed it to show was rehearsed. The edges softened like the corners of a well-loved book. I remembered the envelope I had seen at the Bodleian, the neat, clerical hand, the typed poem, the locked room. Every line mirrored the silence and precision of the dean's visit. A coincidence? Perhaps, but I have learned that coincidences are rarely innocent in Oxford. They are the residue of design, a clue left by circumstance or calculation, waiting for someone who notices. Lewis was watching me, frowning. He thought I was doubting too much. Perhaps I was, Perhaps I was simply reluctant to accept a tidy narrative in a city built on centuries of subtle manipulation and careful restraint. I murmured the words to myself, almost as an observation rather than speech. Too tidy. Life seldom is. Julia rose then, moving to the window, looking out over the quad. Her reflection in the glass showed her face softened by light, but her eyes remained sharp, watchful. I wondered how many of her confessions had been orchestrated, measured to fit the story she wished me to believe. The dean stood silent, hands folded behind his back, like a figure in a portrait, pretending not to notice the passage of time. I imagined him moving through centuries of college hierarchy, every act calculated, every word weighed. Yet even the most careful calculation could not hide everything. The residue of truth lingers, a scent in the air, a note half forgotten in memory, waiting for someone like me to find it. Outside, the rain had begun again, delicate, persistent. Somewhere beneath the arches, the echo of a student's laugh broke the hush of the quad. I lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward in lazy spirals, thinking of the false confession, the measured tears, the careful exit of the dean, and the small, almost invisible inconsistencies that refused to align with the story Lewis found so satisfying. The room smelled of old wood and wet stone, of paper pressed flat beneath years of discipline. I exhaled slowly. There was more here than grief or guilt. There was design, subtle and deliberate, and in that, I found neither comfort nor closure, only the uneasy certainty that the truth would reveal itself, though not without patience. It was close to midnight when I returned to the evidence, the kind of hour that invites reflection more than revelation. When the air in one's rooms grows still and the city outside fades into the sound of its own breathing. My desk was a small geography of disorder papers, photographs, the faint perfume of cigarette smoke and resignation. The case files lay open, like the pages of a book written by a man determined not to tell the truth. I poured myself a measure of whiskey, unhurried, listening to the soft protest of the glass. The rain had begun again beyond the window, tracing thin silver veins against the dark pane. I had always found Oxford more honest in rain, the stones confessing their age, the air carrying a faint bitterness of damp leaves and ink. Fenwick's key lay before me. The faint wax trace along its teeth caught the lamplight like a reluctant confession, wax soft enough to take an impression, subtle enough to betray the hand that used it. I turned it between my fingers, noting a single smudge near the base, blurred but deliberate. Someone had pressed this key against something malleable not once, but twice. The second time hurried, imperfect. Lewis would have dismissed it as nothing. He had gone home hours earlier, content with the theory of despair. But despair leaves a different scent. It smells of finality. Fenwick's room, by contrast, smelled of intrusion, perfume faint near the desk, the ghost of laughter still clinging to the air. A second glass of wine, half drunk, half forgotten. These were not the details of solitude, they were the detritus of company. I read the poem again, the one I'd memorized without wanting to. He locked the door. The key was inside, a line so precise it almost begged to be taken literally. But precision in poetry, as in crime, is often the disguise of misdirection. I closed my eyes and heard Fenwick's voice in the silence, a man whispering the wrong kind of truth. The key was inside, yes, but not when he was alive. I rose and paced the room, the floorboards creaking in quiet accompaniment. I had seen doors like that one in street, Oswald's old, solid oak, the kind that left just enough clearance beneath for a letter to slide through. Or perhaps a key. Someone had locked it from the outside and pushed the key back in, making it appear that death had sealed itself. It was elegant, too elegant. The thought tightened something in my chest. Only someone who knew the building, who had lived with its imperfections, would know that trick. The wax residue was the proof of preparation. The lock had been copied, not forced. There was calculation here, not passion. I set the key down. slowly, as though it might shatter under the weight of its own deceit. Outside, the bell in the tower struck 12. Each chime hung in the air, reluctant to fade, as if counting not hours but mistakes. I poured another drink, though it tasted of nothing. The cigarette smoke curled upward in pale ribbons, dissolving into the lamplight like thought, made visible. In my mind, the sequence arranged itself. The copied key, the poem, the wine for two, a woman's perfume, the locked door, the key returned beneath. The illusion of solitude constructed by someone who understood the rituals of deception. The phrase, "He locked the door," was never Fenwick's confession. It was his epitaph, written by another hand. I sat down again, weary but sharpened, my notebook open before me. I wrote one line in the margin beside the word wax. No man seals his own silence so neatly. From the street below came the faint sound of footsteps, deliberate, unhurried, fading into the distance. For a moment, I thought I recognized the rhythm of them, but it passed. Oxford keeps its secrets well, and even the guilty walk softly here. The rain pressed harder against the glass, blurring the lamps across the street into halos of gold. I stared at them until my eyes stung. Somewhere in the chapel, perhaps, the organist was still awake, rehearsing that same mournful fragment of Wagner Fenwick had loved. The notes drifted through the night like a message carried on water, half memory, half warning. I closed the file, but the case refused to close with it. The wax smudge remained, small, unremarkable, yet heavy with meaning. It was the kind of flaw that explains everything if one looks long enough. And as I extinguished the lamp, I thought not for the first time that truth, like wax, softens only under the right kind of heat. I returned to Street Oswald's just before dawn. The city was still half asleep that delicate hour, when the lamps surrender to the first suggestion of light, and Oxford seems briefly undecided about whether to wake or dream a little longer. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a hush that felt almost ecclesiastical. My breath rose pale in the air as I crossed the quad. Somewhere behind the chapel's stained glass, a candle still burned, its glow soft and tremulous, as if keeping vigil for someone who no longer required it. Miss Halliwell's rooms were on the ground floor of the eastern range, overlooking the gardens. The curtains were drawn, but a faint line of light edged the sill, the kind of light one associates with confession rather than work. I knocked once, softly. The door opened almost at once, as though she had been standing there, waiting. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her composure shrunk to fit the hour. The typewriter sat behind her on the table, a page still wound in the roller. Her hands, clasped before her, were ink-stained. Trembling faintly, she said my name not as greeting but as acknowledgement the end of a waiting she had already endured too long. I told her I had come to speak about the wax, the key, the poem. She turned her face slightly away, toward the window, where the faintest suggestion of dawn was pressing through the fabric. She said nothing for a time, only exhaled a sound that was neither surprise nor fear, merely the weary release of something that had already broken. When she began, her words came evenly, without embellishment. Fenwick had found the falsified accounts records altered to conceal the dean's private payments from college funds. She had done it to protect him, she said. Years ago, they had been lovers, a truth both of them pretended to have forgotten. She had thought him kind. Once, she paused at that, the past tense hanging like smoke. Fenwick had confronted her, quietly, in his room that evening. He had not threatened her, she said. He had offered her something far worse, pity. He told her he would write to the bursar in the morning. She had pleaded with him, promised restitution, begged him to wait. When he refused, she reached for the nearest object, the claret bottle, and struck. The silence that followed felt long and unbroken, even in her recollection. She had stood there, watching him crumple, his spectacles sliding from his face, the sound of the bottle rolling against the floorboards louder than anything that came before it. Then, with a composure I could almost admire, she had begun to arrange the room. The door, she said, was simple enough. She had taken the wax from his sealing kit, pressed the key into it to form a mold, and made a crude duplicate days before a precaution. She called it, though whether against discovery or temptation she did not say. After the blow, she had locked the door from outside, pushed the original key back under with wax and thread, and let it fall against the rug. The illusion was perfect. The second glass on the table was hers. I asked her why she had left the poem. Her hands clenched once, then loosened again. She had typed it weeks earlier for Fenwick's manuscript, The Locked Room. When she read it again that night, she saw its symmetry, its promise of silence. She slipped it under his elbow before she left, not out of guilt, but gratitude. It gave his death meaning, she said, and hers too. The first bells began to sound from the chapel. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. Their rhythm filled the small room like water filling a basin. She seemed to listen to them with a strange calmness, her shoulders settling as though she had been waiting for that very sound. I could have arrested her then. I should have. Instead, I stood there and watched the dawn gather behind her window. When I finally spoke, my voice startled even me. I told her I would return at noon. She nodded, as though the arrangement suited her. As I turned to leave, she asked whether I believed the dean would be spared. I said I doubted it. Oxford forgives many sins, but not the ones that embarrass it. Outside, the quad was silver with dew, the light sharpening across the stones. I looked back once. In her window, the candle still burned, small and steady, refusing to die against the growing day. And as the last bell faded into silence, I wondered, not for the first time, whether truth, once spoken, ever truly sets anyone free. By morning, the college had grown quieter, though not in peace. Silence in Oxford has a way of sounding rehearsed, a collective pause, as if everyone had agreed to speak only once the scandal had sufficiently aged. The newspapers carried nothing beyond the official statement, the dean's resignation for personal reasons, the widow's departure for France to recover her health, and the secretary's arrest pending investigation. It was all arranged with that particular neatness the university reserves for its own small catastrophes. The quads, still wet from the night's rain, reflected the grey light of dawn. Students crossed them in pairs, whispering, half curious, half relieved that whatever had happened had not involved them. The chapel bell tolled late that morning, slow and diffident, as though ashamed to interrupt the stillness. Even the pigeons, perched along the stone parapets, seemed unusually subdued. I stood by the gatehouse for a while, watching the porter sweep leaves into tidy, meaningless piles. He nodded at me, politely avoiding my eyes. There was no hostility in the gesture, only the weary gratitude of a man glad to see an ending of any sort. Oxford dislikes uncertainty more than guilt. Later, I walked to the river. The air was clean and sharp, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and cold metal. The Thames moved sluggishly under the bridge, its surface broken by the occasional ripple of an early scull. I leaned on the rail, the way one does when there is nothing left to prove. The college towers stood behind me, reflected in the water, blurred, inverted, dignified even in distortion. Lock without a key. The phrase returned, unbidden, the same way certain lines of verse do when one is too tired to think of anything new. It had begun as a crossword clue, but like most puzzles, it had outgrown its own intention. Fenwick's life, the affair, the forged accounts, all of it had turned upon the same quiet truth. The locks we keep are never mechanical. They are made of silence, habit, fear. Lewis found me there, as he often did, carrying 2 paper cups of tea that steamed in the cold air. He handed one over without speaking, and for a time we stood together, watching the water shift from pewter to pale gold as the sun attempted its entrance. The light, though faint, gave the river the illusion of warmth. He said it after a long pause. Strange thing, sir, for all that cleverness, no one seemed happy. I smiled, though the gesture felt more like concession than amusement. Happiness, Lewis, is seldom the subject of poetry. He grinned faintly, as though he wasn't sure whether I was joking. Perhaps I wasn't. Across the water, the college clock struck the half-hour. I thought of Julia Fenwick, boarding her train for Calais, carrying with her a grief she would neither deny nor feel entirely. I thought of the dean, now stripped of his clerical dignity, preparing to vanish quietly into some parish in the north, where scandal travels slowly, and Miss Halliwell precise, dutiful, remorseful only in intervals awaiting trial, with the same calm she had once reserved for her typewriter. Each of them, in their way, had chosen a door and locked it behind them. Lewis spoke again, his voice hesitant. "Do you ever wonder, sir, whether we make anything better, or just tidy it up for a while?" I looked at him younger, unspoiled by too much understanding. The question had no answer, only truth. "Sometimes," I said, "but tidy is often the best the world can manage." He didn't reply. The sound of oars drifted toward us, rhythmic and unhurried. The morning light grew stronger. Dissolving the mist, the river brightened until the reflection of the towers sharpened, almost clear enough to mistake for reality. I finished my tea, now lukewarm, and crushed the paper cup between my fingers. The gesture felt final, though I knew it wasn't. Cases never end. They only fall, silent, for a while. Lewis said he'd fetch the car. I nodded, not moving. When he was gone, I looked once more at the water. The ripples caught the light, bending it into fleeting shapes that disappeared before they could be named. The kind of beauty that belongs only to what is unfinished, lock without a key. The phrase came again, softer now, more memory than thought. I murmured it to the river, half in reverence, half in fatigue. Behind me, the bells began to sound for morning service, gentle, inevitable, forgiving. I turned toward them, toward the day, and let the last of the mist swallow my reflection. It was late when I came home. The kind of late that has no clear hour, only the feeling of something ending. The rooms were still, the air heavy with the faint smell of rain that had followed me in from the streets. I switched on the lamp, a small, apologetic light that made the silence more visible. The newspaper lay folded on the table where I'd left it that morning. I knew what it contained before I opened it. The headline was modest, as such things are in Oxford. College secretary confesses to killing tutor. No photographs, no outrage, just the calm, administrative tone of scandal properly contained. I read it once, slowly, the words passing through me like a tune I already knew. They had kept the details brief, no mention of the dean's falsified accounts, or Julia Fenwick's quiet departure, or the poem that had, in the end, told me everything. Miss Halliwell had confessed, the paper said, with composure and regret. I wondered which of the two had come first. The radio was playing in the next room, one of those evening broadcasts of arias no one truly listens to. I recognized Puccini's La Bohème, a soprano's voice rising toward something she would never reach. I stood there a moment, listening, then I turned it off. The silence that followed was heavier than the music. My glass was empty, though I couldn't remember finishing it. Whiskey had left its small amber stain at the bottom, like a memory refusing to evaporate. Outside, the rain began again, a sound soft enough to be mistaken for thought. It tapped against the window, irregular, persistent, familiar. I unfolded the crossword. It had been waiting for me all day. The last few clues blank, patient as ever. I've always liked crosswords not for the solving, but for their illusion of order. Every problem admits an answer. Every word fits if one only looks hard enough. Life has never been so obliging. The final clue stared up at me. Freedom within walls. 7 letters. I stared at it for a long time, the pencil idle in my hand. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed through a puddle, the sound folding into the rhythm of the rain. I thought of Miss Halliwell in her cell, the walls white, the silence deliberate. I thought of Fenwick's room, locked from the outside but made to appear otherwise. I thought of the Dean, unburdened now, free to grieve publicly what he had long since buried privately. Freedom within walls. The answer came slowly, as they always do when they matter. I wrote it out, each letter deliberate, reluctant to finish. Love. I set the pencil down. The word looked absurd on the page, and yet I couldn't imagine a better one. Love, the thing that begins as freedom and ends as confinement. The reason for every secret, every silence. Fenwick had loved truth. Perhaps too much. The Dean had loved his reputation. Julia, her survival. And Miss Halliwell, she had loved a man who had already ceased to exist, except in the brittle nostalgia of guilt. It ran in soft rivers down the glass, distorting the light from the street below. I reached out and locked the window, not because of the weather, but because I preferred it that way. A room closed against the world is the closest thing to peace a man like me can manage. I folded the newspaper carefully and placed it beneath the lamp. The print left a faint smudge on my fingertips, the kind that never quite washes off. Somewhere in the house, the pipes sighed. The city would be sleeping now. The colleges dreaming their ancient, repetitive dreams. I thought, absurdly, of the candle I had seen in Miss Halliwell's window at dawn, burning against the light that had already defeated it. I wondered whether she had known, even then, what she would do, or whether confession, like love, always feels inevitable only in retrospect. I finished the crossword, though it offered no satisfaction. The page looked complete but not resolved, like the end of a poem whose rhythm lingers long after its meaning fades. I sat back, listening to the steady tapping of the rain. Each drop struck the glass with a patience that felt almost human, freedom within walls. Love. I whispered the word once, softly, as if testing its weight. Then I reached for the glass again, though it was already empty, and let the sound of the rain write the rest of the evening for me.